1989, The End of History. The event is hosted, my name is Adoni Melopoulos. I'm a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society here at OSU. The Platypus Affiliated Society is a campus-based group. It was established in Chicago in 2006, and we organize reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s and 70s, and post-political 1980s and 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We do this through fora like this one that we're having tonight, and I think we've been thinking about our next one. Will probably be in January. It'll be on the Anthropocene. Our open submission journal, the Platypus Review, which is free and available at the back. We're always looking for contributions in the editorial statements on the back, so if you're inspired to write something, go ahead. We do a weekly reading group, which is starting next Wednesday. The syllabus is on the back, and we meet on campus. And then there's an informal coffee gathering on Tuesdays at 5:30 at the Marketplace West coffee shop on campus. There is a sign-up sheet at the back. If you want to be notified of these campus activities, go ahead and sign up. And let me just introduce our panelists for tonight. Sarah Henderson teaches a variety of internationally themed political science classes in the School of Public Policy at OSU, and her research focuses on contemporary Russian politics. Her books are Building Democracy in Contemporary Russia and Women and Politics in a Global World, in addition to a number of articles that address the status of Russian civil society. Beside her is Alan Lunceford. He has graciously agreed to fill in after one of the panelists was unable to attend. Adam is the secretary and co-chair of Heart of the Valley
It's a whole mouthful. Democratic Socialists of America.
Thank you. Bill Smaldone is beside Adam. He teaches European history at Willamette University, and his research focuses on the Central European labor movement in the first half of the 20th century. His books are Rudolf Hilferding, The Tragedy of a German Social Democrat, Confronting Hitler, German Social Democrats in the Defense of the Weimar Republic, 1929 to 1933, and European Socialism, a concise history with documents. In recent years, he's also co-published documentary collections on Austro-Marxism. Politically, he's also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and Solidarity. And we have a fourth panelist who's also a last-minute addition. Unfortunately, she is stuck in traffic, so she may slide in here gracefully in the middle of the panel. GL Morrison. GL is an intersectional activist and organizer for over 40 years. Geo Morrison is a cis-white poet and current state chair of the Communist Party of Oregon, Communist Party, which is an affiliate of the Communist Party USA. Let me begin by reading the panel prompts that the participants have been asked to prepare their remarks around. 1989 is largely remembered as a decisive close to the Cold War contest between communism and capitalism, with the victory of the latter casting a seemingly damning verdict against Marxism as a form of politics. The planned economies based on collectivized property of these states were indicted as failures, and their totalitarian regimes called into question the very notion of working class rule. The fall of communism thus profoundly affected the left's ability to imagine the overcoming of capitalism and the possibility of a classless society beyond it. But in passing into history, the meaning of we're good, yeah. But in passing it, if you don't mind muting your phones, that'd be great, including mine, unfortunately, cannot be. But in passing into history, the meaning of 1989 can also be reconsidered. The panel will use this anniversary to reassess the question of how 1989 weighs on the present. What is the significance of 1989 in its historical context, and what is its relevance for left politics today? The guidelines, our panelists have 15 minutes for opening remarks. After that, there will be an opportunity for brief responses from the panelists. We promise to keep this to 1 to 2 points of agreement and disagreement with the other panelists before handing it off to you for question and answer. Questions or comments are welcome from the audience, but please try to, I was going to say keep it to a minute length, but I mean, if everybody had a question that was 2 minutes long in this audience, would be cool.
I think she's here. She said she's outside and confused.
Okay. All right, I will get the first 15 minutes to see if you can find GL outside. Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, okay. I'll
Sarah,
start.
take it away.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out on this rainy night. And true to form, I have handouts. Sorry to make it feel like class. But I usually have visuals that I like to point to. I realized after I emailed Andoni that it was going to be a total pain for him to try to find something just to show like two visuals up on a screen. Just bear with me.
Okay, great.
It's mostly as I get older, I can't just sort of talk off the top of my head, so I need things to refer to. So first of all, thank you for asking me, because what I realized after you had emailed me, I didn't even realize we were coming up on the 30th anniversary of 1989, and I thought that in and of itself was very interesting, because usually if you sort of Google, like every 5 years, you know, there's a spate of news articles. So I thought, you know, what's going on that sort of, it's not being remarked on more. But this topic is really close to my heart personally and professionally, in part because in 1988, when I was in high school, my parents moved to East Berlin to do some research. Bill and I were just exchanging East Berlin memories. I crossed the wall every day to go to high school. And then the next year when I went off to college, I started taking Russian because I was interested and kind of the country that had been part of this Cold War that created East Germany. And then the wall fell my freshman year of college. And it was such a momentous event that at Oberlin classes were canceled. You didn't do anything for 2 days. There were sort of like day-long forums to kind of talk about how momentous this was. And I, in fact, took Russian, went to Russia in 1992, kind of lived through the first year after the Soviet Union had collapsed and was trying to implement free market capitalism and democracy, and then happened to be in Russia for really big events in the following 2 decades. So I care about this in part because it's my academic study, but I've borne witness at various times to kind of how this has happened. So I've kind of drifted a little bit from the prompt, I apologize. But I think there are 3 big things to talk about. That 1989 did change the world. I think Bill's gonna talk a lot on that. And I just wanna add some other key things maybe about how in political science and how we think about politics, how 1989 changed not just the discipline, but policy practitioners. And I think one thing that it did that we often don't think about is that it fundamentally changed what bilateral and kind of multilateral organizations do. So say, for example, the United Nations, which had for such a long time been kind of a proxy for the Cold War, where not a whole lot could necessarily get done beyond the high drama of kind of the General Assembly and the Security Council. I think it made the UN relevant in a very different way. It broadly expanded its mission in terms of peacekeeping, and also in terms of peace building. I think the World Bank, whose reputation was somewhat in tatters because of structural adjustment policy, I think it helped shift their agenda somewhat to looking back more at poverty reduction. And it also changed the foreign policy of a lot of countries in the West, to where they focused a lot more not on establishing kind of democracy foreign aid, but also in terms of what alliances they were willing to build or not build. And I think Bill's going to talk about a lot of that. I think it also fundamentally changed the field of political scientists, of science. And so that's because if you look at this handout on this first little graph, when it says electoral democracies in the world, I think if you sort of look at this, and when you see the term electoral democracy, it kind of means countries that have competitive and sort of relatively free and fair elections. The collapse of communism was part of what became known as a much larger wave of democratization called the third wave. And you can see how dramatically that number increases throughout the 1980s and beyond. And so what it did do is it changed what we cared about. It used to be democracy was only an entity that existed in Western European countries, Japan, North America. And so now, right, it seemed as if it was the end of history. There was a lot more interest as well, though, in terms of what makes authoritarian regimes collapse, right? Why do democracies endure? Does it matter if you have a presidential or a parliamentary system? It led us to be interested in new things, right? Civil society. Why is it important? And there were big meta questions, right? If the 20th century really was, to some extent, about the battle of isms, fascism, liberalism, communism, it looked like liberalism was kind of the only ideology around which to organize was left standing. So kind of what was going to then frame conflict? And so I think my first point is that because 1989 did change the world, it also changed what kinds of issues, not just academics, but also what policy practitioners cared about and what they did. I think a second key thing that I was thinking about that might be interesting for us is kind of what happened after 1989. What were the paths out of communism? What happened to all of those 29 countries from the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc? You know, we sort of talk about it often as this kind of monolithic thing in which all countries were impacted similarly. But I think another key thing in the intervening 30 years has been a wide variation in how that transition has gone. And so initially there was a lot of optimism that the challenges of economic, political, and social transition would go relatively smoothly, right? There was almost a naivete that, you know, if you just kind of remove the authoritarian system, all people were at heart natural capitalists and Democrats, you know, and you just had to kind of remove the impediments to that and then it would flow forth. Obviously, that didn't happen, right? But it did happen more easily in some countries than others. And so if you kind of look at, if you flip the page, I'm not forcing you, you don't have to. On the back, there have kind of been three paths, I would say, out of 1989, three big groups of countries. And this is just basically a map. I know it's not super clear. But I think for some countries, the Baltics, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, you know, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. It was a return to Europe. Eastern Germany was just kind of absorbed into West Germany. Then you sort of see a middle batch of countries, Bulgaria, Romania, former Yugoslavia countries, which we would call kind of hybrid regimes. Right? Often they had kind of competitive elections, somewhat functioning economies, right? But often those elections maybe were free but somewhat unfair, right? They sort of seem kind of stuck in the middle. And finally, you have this kind of third path of a group of countries, and that would be led by Russia. Countries which initially, right, may have had a free or a competitive election, but then, right, politics gradually devolved into consolidation of rule around one person, right, or one particular party. And so if you also look at this map, and this visual is taken from a nonprofit called Freedom House, which kind of tries to measure the quantity and quality of democracy around the world. And what you'll kind of see is that historically, after 1989, Europe and Russia kind of operated as these two magnets, which tended to sort of pull in neighboring countries. And we'll talk about maybe how that's broken down a little bit in the past 10 years. If you flip the page, you'll also see there's a lot of variation in terms of how citizens of these countries have perceived their own lives in the past 30 years. And so what I always say when I have a visual, take it all with a grain of salt, right? It's not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning. And so I pulled this off from the Pew Foundation. They just released a study of public opinion of citizens and compared it with previous surveys. Part of it was to compare with them how they answered the same questions, 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier. But if you just look at the data, you'll see that, right, citizens of different countries experience that transition to a multi-party system and a market economy quite differently. With the further east you travel, it being much more of a contested transition. I think I'll probably be close out of time. So I think the third thing I want to talk about is current trends with the rise of right-wing populist movements, Hungary and Poland and the Eastern Bloc, and the increasing capacity of Russia to serve as a dark power, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you flip back to that first page, and you'll see this visual that says 11 years of decline, where are we now? When we read the stories of setbacks in Hungary or setbacks in Poland, these are not isolated events. That since 2005, there's been a gradual trend in terms of democratic erosion in countries all over the world. And so what this visual shows you is, and the line doesn't come through very well, but that top number shows in how many countries registered declines and something to do with their civil rights or civil liberties. And the bottom number shows in how many countries overall were there net gains. And so the only thing to take away from that visual is that every single year since 2006, there have been more declines than gains. And that what we see are three big trends. The global democratic recession has been most severe in these third wave 1989 democratization countries. That's one. Second, it's spread to consolidated democracies, which I think Bill's probably talk about it a little bit. But I think a third trend is the rise of countries like Russia and China that are willing to offer an alternative model. But this is very different from the days of the Cold War, in which I would say Russia doesn't necessarily offer a competing ideology necessarily in the way that communism presented a set of coherent beliefs about how society and the economy should be organized. And this new form of leadership that they're now exporting, to some sense, is what I would call kind of 21st century authoritarianism. 20th century authoritarianism, I would say, in some ways, probably might have relied more on the military or the army or actual kind of repression on the streets in order to perhaps enforce its rule. I think in the 21st century, what Putin is perfecting is, I would say, various ways in which to change the rules of the game to make the playing field relatively unfair, so that you can have an opposition, but an opposition that can't win. And so many of the methods that you see being used in Hungary, being used in Poland and elsewhere, originated in Russia, with co-opting the judiciary, with gaining control of the legislature, with writing rules of the game to make it difficult for civic activists to maneuver. Okay. And so when I think about 30 years after the collapse of communism, I think in some ways there no longer is necessarily a kind of trying to decide, right, if we can still say that there's something singular about the post-communist experience. But what I do think when I think about 30 years, in 1989, nobody thought the Soviet Union would collapse. It did in 1991. But I also think in maybe 1991, I never thought that in 30 years or 28, Russia would be once again ruled by the same person, now getting ready to mark nearly his 20th year in power. And so even though communism collapsed in the Soviet Union, I feel Putinism is an ideology without values, but it is one that increasingly kind of resembles the aging years of the Brezhnev era in the Soviet Union. So that's probably my 15 minutes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Sure. You don't have to clap. Okay, all right.
Going on. All right. So, like I said, my name is Adam. I'm with the Heart of Valley DSA, and most specifically, do want to at least put it out there first that I describe myself as a libertarian socialist. It means more like socialist in the more the anarchist vein. And so, kind of along with that, that's kind of going to be one of my big points with this whole thing. Essentially, the main critique of the Soviet Union that I have is that foundations are everything, and the foundations were very poorly made. I'm going to be looking a lot more at what it means practically for people on the left today, on what it means to learn the lessons of the Soviet Union is essentially what I'm going to be talking about. I do think that it is important to look at the good that the Soviet Union did do for some people. It did do massive industrialization and rapidly increased the amount of agricultural output and brought an end to the famine cycle that had rocked Russia for the entirety of of people living in that region. And also the fact that they beat the Nazis can't really be just completely thrown away. And that also the liberalization process was an absolute horror show that killed lots and lots of people. That kind of ends where I'm going to be talking nice about the Soviet Union. It wouldn't be a leftist critique of the Soviet Union without relitigating 1917. Essentially, the main problem that I have with the Soviet Union and with the Vanguard Party idea and with the way that it was created was the fact that, unlike the question says, the Soviet agriculture and Soviet industry was not collectivized, it was nationalized. And that might sound like a semantics question, but it's really not, because collectivization means that the people who are working the actual industry control that industry and make the decisions of that industry. And nationalization is that it is put under the control of a national government that, at least ostensibly, is supposed to act in the best interests of those people or listen to those people. But that is fundamentally not collectivization, at least from my perspective. And this is very clearly shown by the left SR Bolshevik split during the Russian Revolution, where a lot of the SRs wanted to have a collectivization of farmland. There's a whole strain of philosophy that I won't get into, but that they wanted to collectivize the farmland in a way that many of the same ways that the peasants had been working on their farms would remain unchanged, and everything would be owned in common, except they wouldn't have to be giving all of their surplus things to the Lord or to the Tsar. And that was one of the big problems that the Bolsheviks ran into, is that the program that they were selling now to the peasants was not a radical change. It was the same thing as you've always had, except now instead of giving it to the landlords, you give it to us, being the central government. And so the peasants on the nationalized lands that had been collectivized didn't see a whole lot of change from their old systems. And the kulaks, who had become kind of a new like yeoman farmer, essentially, in a more Western context, had their lands taken away and nationalized, which they were not happy about. And especially because it had just been given to them, either by the Tsar or by the new economic policy. So then the Civil War breaks out in full, and war communism, or the Russian Civil War following the revolution, war communism begins. All industry is completely nationalized. Their striking is completely banned, and everything is put under direct state control. This continues on until, I believe, 1921, when Lenin began the new economic policy, which was an attempt to try to bring in capitalist elements into the system, because people were complaining about how war communism was working, because you couldn't strike and everything was controlled nationally, and there was lots of problems that people had with that. But it is my view that NEP was the wrong direction to go on that. Instead of putting the means of production in the hands of the workers, it created capitalists, and it created more and more people that personally held, the means of production in the Marxist jargon, which meant that these people were now invested in maintaining that ownership. And if you're trying to make a communist society or a socialist society even, you need to make sure that those people don't have that, because the whole point is supposed to be that the workers control the means of production. And these capitalists also were incredibly unhappy when Stalin came into power and ended the NEP and renationalized all their factories, and they were very, very mad about that. Essentially, once Stalinization began, a lot of the restrictions from war communism returned, and instead they could have gone with more of the left or anarchist direction with it. Specifically, the one that always gets trotted out is Revolutionary Catalonia. It had massive increases in production with workers collectives, both in the cities and in the countrysides. There is some debate on exactly the amount. There's debate on the production figures that are put out. A lot of more anarchist people have said that there was a drastic increase, like 50% increase in production. And there's been other people who've come along and said, nah, not really. I personally believe the anarchists, because I'm an anarchist, and I think that a lot of these people were on the ground in Catalonia, and that they probably had a lot of insight into exactly what was going on, rather than people who were writing about it, 40 years after everyone involved was probably dead. And so the reason why that's really important is because it got people involved in the actual struggle of the revolution. It got people, instead of being just cogs in the machine, to being consulted about every decision. And when you're consulted about the decisions, about what you're making, where it's going to, where the bullets are going to, all these sorts of things, you get people that are a lot more invested in what happens in the society. And that's what's really, really important if you want to build a stable society that is able to continue on. The anarchists were eventually crushed by an alliance of the liberals and the Stalinists, not the fascists, by the way. And so, essentially that is my main critique of the 1917, and then really the big problem that I have is the Vanguard Party. If No's not aware, I know.
I'm here making faces.
Yeah. But the Vanguard Party is the idea that a small dedicated cadre of dedicated communists will lead the proletariat to the revolution. I vehemently disagree that that's how that can work. I think specifically with the Soviet Union, with the cult of personality around Stalin and to a lesser extent Lenin, it led to a lot of passivity, drawing on a lot of the old ideas of the Tsar as the benevolent father figure for the Russian people, which made it so that people just kind of, again, they were like, oh, just like the old times, we'll just go along with it and we'll be fine, which meant, again, that they weren't invested in the revolution. There was also a turn to Russian nationalism under Stalin specifically, which, like, for example, changing the anthem from the Internationale to a more Russian-oriented anthem. There was continuing Russification policies. Oh, no, not yet. Also, I do know that Stalin was Georgian, and a lot of people will use that as an example of why it wasn't Russification, but it still was. It was to calm down a lot of the Russian factions within the Soviet Union that were being more nationalist. Also led, that's fine. The Russification policies continued with ethnic cleansing in the Central Asian SRs and assimilationist policies across the USSR, trying to make essentially Muscovite Russian culture the dominant culture in the USSR. And I use ethnic cleansing not necessarily in the like Bosnian or Rwandan like murders and such, although I'm sure that those did happen. It's more in the forced migration of people either into regions or out of regions. Specifically, Kazakhstan went from, a lot of regions in Kazakhstan went from being majority Kazakh to being Russian. And these policies also continued on in Siberia and continue on to this day in a lot of ways. So again, when all the decisions are made by the Central Politburo, ordinary people have no real say. And when they feel less involved in the system, they feel a lot less dedicated to actually defending the revolution because they don't feel like it's their revolution. They think that it's the party in Moscow, and the party in Moscow is really fighting for this, but whatever, I'm a peasant and I'll just farm my food and it'll be fine. And so that core dedicated group of revolutionaries that is supposed to be the vanguard of the revolution will be given massive power after the revolution, because that's the whole point. It's supposed to be that they are the only ones that can really lead it to that conclusion. Even if the first set of the Vanguard Party is absolutely pure of heart, no chance of ever being corrupted, eventually they'll die out, and there is no guarantee that their successors will be able to maintain that line that they had set out. And it only takes the corruption of a few dozen people to bring the whole system down. Not only that, but that's also, again, assuming that the entire first vanguard is completely and totally incorruptible. And if any of them get corrupted, it's the same problem. If anyone in that core group becomes more liberal and wants to be more of a capitalist, that's kind of how it goes, because there's not a whole lot of checks and balances from the rest of the system to bring it back down, because of the way that it is very a top-down oriented system. They also treated a lot of the socialist republics and the Eastern Bloc as imperial satellites rather than brothers and sisters in the revolution, as they had kind of talked about, using them essentially as little more than colonies. This means that the people that are in these places begin to chafe under Soviet rule. All the same problems that I was talking about in Russia are here in East Germany, in Poland, in these other places, and they also have the added thing of it being imposed by a foreign power, which people never like. And it caused the USSR to invest massively in the military to quell the uprisings that would periodically show up. The problem being that the military has little to do other than to quell these uprisings, which means that it becomes more and more corrupt and weaker and weaker. People essentially will think more of the idea of stealing from the government in terms of corruption is easier to swallow when you don't have any investment in that government. If you think that the government is essentially if you think you are part of the government and that the entire system and the entire revolution revolves around you and your material needs, you're not going to want to be corrupt, because it'd be like stealing from yourself. And so that's, again, why the top-down strategy caused a lot of at least in my opinion, caused a lot of this corruption. And you can see this corruption and awfulness in the war in Afghanistan. Despite the Afghanistan being very small, it was a complete failure on the part of the Soviets, and massive amounts of money and troops were sent, and they were still under-equipped and unprepared. Most Soviets didn't have more than 2 magazines for their AKs, if I remember correctly, in any given engagement, which is nowhere near enough. essentially, this caused the war to drag on more and more, escalating the cost. And the war also showed that the USSR was not capable of putting down insurrections, which made it so that both peoples within the USSR and the people in the Eastern Bloc were like, oh, we could just say no to the Russians. We can just do an insurrection and we can throw off the yoke. And as the economic struggles hit the USSR and the leadership was unwilling to utilize harsh measures in 1989 to crush a lot of these revolutions, Soviet forces left in 1989, and that was part of what caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think that's my time.
I don't know if it is 1 second. 2 seconds. Good job, Adam.
Exactly as I planned.
Okay, should I begin? Hi, I'm Bill Smaldone. I'm from Willamette University, where I teach German history and Russian history. The opening of the Berlin Wall symbolized the collapse of the Soviet model in Eastern Europe. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the communist movement virtually disappeared as a force in world politics. With the exception of North Korea and to a lesser extent Cuba, in countries where communist parties continue to rule, they have largely jettisoned Soviet economic models while retaining a monopoly on power. The legacies of 1989 for the socialist left are many, and only a few can be touched upon in a 15-minute presentation. Since I am an historian who grew up during the Cold War, my thinking on the subject reflects my personal experiences, my academic work, and my contemporary politics. I became a socialist in the late 1970s, but I was never a member of any communist formation such as the CPUSA or the Socialist Workers' Party. For me, the Soviet Union was non-capitalist, but was not, and never had been, a state where the workers held power. For me, if it were a choice between living in a liberal bourgeois republic, like the one in the United States, or in a dictatorship resting largely on compulsion, I have always preferred the liberal republic, which, as Marx and Engels clearly recognized, was an advance over all forms of absolutism. I agreed with Bruno Rizzi and with Hal Draper and others that the Soviet Union was neither capitalist nor socialist. It was a new system in which a bureaucratic party state owned and controlled the national wealth and supervised economic reproduction. We hoped that this bureaucratic collectivist order could be transformed into a democratic socialist one, but such hopes were dashed by the events of the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So there are 4 basic points that I'd like to make here tonight about the legacy of 1989, and you'll see there's quite a bit of overlap with what's been said so far, but a few different things too. The first concerns looking at the Soviet Union as an experiment in non-capitalist economic modernization. No one expected a socialist revolution in Russia in 1917. Since Marx and Engels had generally argued that socialist revolution would first occur in highly productive, advanced industrial countries where class-conscious urban workers were organized, politically schooled, and prepared to make revolution, no one thought that a socialist revolution could succeed in a society like Russia's, in which a few small islands of industrial modernity were surrounded by a sea of peasants. When Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in October, they did so because they were convinced that it would spark revolution in the advanced Western countries in the midst of war, and that the West would then help Russia in its socialist transition. When that failed to occur, the Bolsheviks did not really know how to go forward. They didn't know what to do. After a decade of experimentation in which it was unclear whether the state would favor the interests of a minority of urban workers or a peasant majority, Stalin settled the matter by implementing a policy of forced draft industrialization carried out within the framework of 5-year plans drawn up by the state and theoretically financed by the forced collectivization of agriculture. And the results were contradictory. Between 1928 and 1939, Russia did make the leap into the industrial age. Heavy industry expanded enormously. Millions left the rural areas for the cities and benefited from new educational and work opportunities. Industrialization facilitated the modernization of the military, and one must remember, as Andrew pointed out, that it was the Soviet-built tanks and planes that defeated Nazism on the battlefield during the Second World War. We'll leave out the discussion of Stalin and Hitler till later. The costs, however, were equally enormous. Millions of peasants were forcibly driven off the land. Millions died or were virtually enslaved in state-controlled co-ops and collective farms. Agricultural production collapsed, and instead of rising, the standard of living for most Soviet citizens fell in the 1930s and did not really begin to rise until after Stalin's death in 1953. It was only then that Soviet planners gave more emphasis to the production of consumer goods, including housing. Thus, the Soviet Union was, to a large extent, an experiment in non-capitalist economic modernization. With planning implemented from the top down over the course of decades, the country did modernize, and the standard of living gradually did improve. By 1985, 65% of the people lived in cities, millions of families lived in new, though often cramped apartments, and 80 to 90% of households owned amenities such as refrigerators, televisions, radios, and washing machines. In the first 3 decades of the post-1945 era, many developing countries were attracted to the Soviet model, which appeared as a reasonable alternative to the capitalist system under which they had long suffered. By the 1980s, however, it was clear that the Soviet model had run out of steam. Growth had virtually ceased. Available goods were shoddy. The economy was unable to respond to consumer demand or to make the leap into the computer age. Soviet elites knew that their Western counterparts lived better, and many wanted to emulate them. Gorbachev's reforms in the latter 1980s were a failed effort to salvage the system. The events of 1989 and 1991 marked its bankruptcy. Future developmental models that aim to break with capitalism can learn much from the Soviet experience of central planning, nationalization, and collectivization. An essential part of that lesson should be that workers and consumers need real power in any system calling itself socialist. The second point I'd like to make concerns the bankruptcy of the Vanguard Party as a vehicle of social and political transformation, about which we've already heard a little bit. I will be brief. The Bolsheviks saw themselves as a disciplined, ideologically pure vanguard, charged with the tasks of leading the masses in revolution and securing the transition to socialism. The party was effective in seizing and holding power after 1917, but its failure to build a democratic political and economic system and its reliance on force undermined the system's legitimacy. If there is no democracy, there is no socialism. I recognize fully that the emergence of the single-party state occurred in a complicated context of civil war, foreign intervention, and economic underdevelopment. Nevertheless, the Bolshevik leadership made a choice to deny access to power to any group that may have disagreed with them, even if they supported the revolution in general. Indeed, the emergence of a dominant faction within the Bolshevik Party under Stalin's leadership destroyed any vestiges of democracy within the party itself and allowed Stalin to hone the instruments of terror which already had emerged during the Civil War for use against the Bolsheviks' perceived enemies, to now be used against anyone he perceived as a threat. The result was the implementation of mass terror on all levels of society that led to the atomization of individuals and a universal fear in which it became almost impossible for people to live in truth. Therefore, the post-1989 left cannot rely on Bolshevik models for building a democratic socialist movement. Any socialist formation that hopes to build society in which people can truly exercise democratic self-determination must have at its center a robust devotion to pluralism in all aspects of its political work. The third point is the major effect of the collapse of 1989 on countries in the post-colonial world who were attempting to chart a non-capitalist path forward had now lost all room for maneuver once the Soviet Union was gone. Soviet assistance, direct and indirect, in places like Cuba, Nicaragua, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Vietnam, and elsewhere, provided a key countervailing force against American and Western imperialism and facilitated the national liberation of a number of countries. The disappearance of Soviet power after 1989 and 1991 was a disaster for societies aiming to pursue alternative paths to capitalism. With the entire world enthralled to rules established by the United States and its allies, rules that are enforced by such organizations as the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, it would be an uphill battle for any socialist movement operating in a single country to challenge the system even if it comes to power. So, it will be incumbent on future socialists to reorganize the movement on an international basis and to join forces to push for change. This has happened only haltingly, even in places where international structures for cross-border cooperation are in place, such as the European Union. A really good example of this, I'll give you two examples, since I have a few minutes yet. I'll give two examples of what could be accomplished before and what can't be accomplished now, or what's been difficult now. So if we think about what happened before, without Soviet assistance, right, the African National Congress in South Africa would never have been able to challenge the South African state, right? And it was Soviet assistance to Cuba that allowed Cuba, right, to then intervene in Angola, right, and essentially throw the South African Defense Forces, which had moved into Namibia and were moving into Angola, it threw them off balance. And it forced the South African army to withdraw from Angola, to withdraw from Namibia, and ultimately it forced the whites in South Africa to cut a deal with the blacks. That would never have happened if the Soviet Union had not existed, right? And if Cuba had not existed, right, to fight in that particular moment, right, as a proxy for the Soviet Union. If you think about the present, right, and the difficulties, right, trying to build international cooperation, even within a framework where the socialist parties have some institutional advantages, look at the EU. In the EU, you have social democratic and left parties who are trying to organize across borders and to form a policy that can be applied across Europe. And they are repeatedly failing to do this. Right? The best example is the Greek example, right, where essentially a social democratic and Christian democratic coalition government in Germany, right, basically they clamped their boot down on the necks of the Greeks, right, even though it was very clear that everything the Germans were doing in Greece, right, ran contrary to the interests and to the wishes of the Greek people, right, and an allied political party, Syriza, which was in power. Okay. This brings me then to my last point. The collapse of the Soviet Union and its allied states had contradictory impacts on the global left. On the one hand, it led to the dissolution of the world communist movement, which, in the minds of many, signified the end of the socialist alternative. Thus, many social democratic parties shifted decisively to the right and adopted the third way politics of Clinton, Blair, and Schroeder. On the other hand, the long socialist-communist divide also ended. And that creates the possibility of a new democratic socialist politics. The economic disaster of 2008, massive inequality, and the climate catastrophe have led many to question the viability of capitalism and given new impetus to a revived left, as well as a revived right, radical right. In many European states, for example, parties to the left of the old social democratic parties have filled the vacuum created when the Social Democrats moved to the right. So, for example, the Linke party in Germany, the Left party in Sweden, Podemos in Spain, and Syriza in Greece. These parties have been labeled populist by elites who fear mass movements that could challenge their power. But leftists should not fear the term populist. They should embrace it. What is important is the content of the movement's politics. The successful socialist movement of the future will have to return to the universalist roots of its past, when it stood for the emancipation and empowerment not just of workers, but of all the oppressed. Such a politics will require flexible thinking and lots of democratic debate, not only about how to win power, but also how the future should look. Thanks.
Thanks, Gail, for braving Portland traffic and to join us.
The rain was intense.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry to have missed some of your speech, and is there a recording?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, give me if you can't hear me, give me some sort of gesture. So, I'm going to try really hard to resist. I did not realize when we talked how much difference of opinion we would have. So I'm going to try to not let what I was going to say be entirely clouded by wanting to argue with points and semantics. Excellent, excellent. So we'll just leave it that I am not responding to that does not mean I agree with that synopsis of history, what is meant by Vanguard Party, the divisions between anarchists and communists, how they got there. Now I'm going to get back to what I was trying to think about before, which is, so I've come at this from a less academic perspective and more, I started with like, where was I, in the 80s? I also, of course, called, you mentioned to everyone that I'm CP USA, that
Yes.
when we're like tankies and Vanguard Party, it's this side of the table. Okay. So, I was like, what were we doing in the world when this happened? Where was I? Because, I'm in my mid-50s. So I can remember where I was, and I was, an activist in the 80s, and I've been an out communist since I was about 11 years old, and was like horrified by the Pledge of Allegiance in school. I'm like, you want me to make this kind of nationalist vow to fight with people I don't know? I'm like, not going to do it. Spent a lot of time discussing that with but that's about me, not about the CP. So, what do David Bowie, Eurythmics, Ronald Reagan, MTV, and Coca-Cola have in common? They all either have taken credit for or been given credit for the collapse of the Berlin Wall and of the Soviet bloc and communism in general, okay? So, and there is a little tiny grain of truth in there, in that they were the vehicle, if not the impetus of how that happened. And so one of the things that we don't talk about, it's easy to look from this distance about the economic pressures but the cultural revolutions and the cultural pressures. And I think we see that happening around us, but we don't always have an accurate lens on the coalitions that we're forming and the reactions to things. So we need to look back on that. I did want to say, when you brought up the 1917 stuff, that as this is the 100th year of the CPUSA, we've been around since 1917, and we have been running a thing on Twitter. So if you search the 1917, you can follow John Reed or Stalin or what they were doing as if they were really alive and on Twitter. So it's really a lot of fun, actually. So the part of the thing that it is, the truth of that is that they went to the wall and they started doing concerts. Eurythmics, David Bowie, they did concerts just days before things came down. And the thing that I think that is kind of universally accepted is that there was this kind of glee, that people were running to get over the wall, and that there was glee from people living in East Berlin when the wall came down. And that to a great extent, it's commercials and the MTV plugging in and running 24-hour things, and that over the years, rock and roll, from like the 50s on, had started to really sell this idea that there was this really beautiful world where you could have Coca-Cola every day, and and that when we talk about the poverty, the terrible poverty in these communist and socialist countries, and how they were, what we're really talking about is a lack of choice, like that we had in the West, this kind of incredible glut. And in the 80s, for those of you who are too young to remember the 80s, there was serious, it was the greed generation. There was money being made. It was not uncommon for, so sorry about that.
That was Stalin.
Was it Stalin saying, hey? Yes, I'll get my re-education after this.
Yeah.
So, and where I was is, we were fighting on the fronts of the AIDS. We were fighting Ronald Reagan and, the kind of the mosquitoes will get you, and let's put gays in camps. And that's, here, in the U.S. We were, and when you look at what was happening, in the greater thing, you have to think that, Chernobyl happened in '85. Where is that impact in? But when we go back to the rock and roll metaphor, okay, the people who were living where they didn't deal with evictions, where they didn't have housing concerns, where they didn't have health care concerns, where they maybe didn't have the same choices they saw.
Sorry, the power just went off on me.
Stalin again. Or are we going to give that one to someone else?
Trotsky. That's a
Trotsky, that explains so much. So they really believed they could have the best of both worlds. And there's nothing wrong with us as humans wanting the best of both worlds. But what happened, and I think we were talking about Victor Grossman's experience where, in the McCarthy era, he and a bunch of other U.S. Servicemen who were serving in Germany were like, oh my God, these McCarthy hearings are happening and we are members of the CPUSA and we don't know where that's going to go and where we're going to end up in jail because we didn't disclose that and we're in the military. So they actually swam the Danube into to join East Berlin. And Victor Grossman is still alive and living in Berlin and has written about the back and forth of that. And one of the things that he said was that nobody anticipated that maybe a third of people's lives would be improved by this sudden access to choice. But a third of the people, might not see a huge difference, and then another third would be the ones who were homeless, who are now in this reunified Germany as the resented immigrants, and that one of the things the split happened is on the east side of the German wall we had, great, strong anti-fascist programming, very much, they did not let any of the Nazis stay in power that we saw happening on the so-called, open free, we see some of the same people in power that are alarming. We see that. And we also see that what comes out of so there was sexual freedom. There was the last film to come out of the East German collective is called Coming Out, and it is about a gay teacher. It's also an interesting metaphor for the reunification and communism with the rest of the world, things that are happening there. But in 1960, they had outlawed in Germany all of the anti-sex laws that we were still struggling with, and those reforms did not get made on the free side of the wall until 1994. So there's so much to consider when we juggle there that yes, the eyes were literally bugging at the idea that on the other side of the wall you get to listen free to David Bowie every day, and there's Coca-Cola every time you want it, but they could not imagine what it would be like to not be given an apartment. It's just an unthinkable thing. Just as in the US in the 40s and stuff, the communists believed, everything that they heard bad about what was happening in Soviet, we just disbelieved. John Reed disbelieved it, Paul Robeson disbelieved it. They went there, they saw the positive things. And so the fact that the dictatorship of the proletariat, was often being run by some kind of, closed authoritarian leadership, and where that military ethic comes from. But that doesn't belong to the Soviets alone. I mean, this so-called Cold War is where the spycraft and all sorts of weird, experimentation culturally comes out of. And we have to own that on every side of the globe. But I was going back to, where am I time-wise? 5 minutes? Okay. So back to rock and roll as both the burden and the savior of socialism. So in the US, we did all sorts of things to kind of control it. You know, particularly, you might know the thing about country music and white supremacy and, you know, the Johnson administration. If you don't, Google it. It's great fun stuff. But they did a little bit of that, you know, in Eastern Bloc countries. Punk rock was this thing that identified itself, and I was a punk rock kid, identified itself as a DIY movement, you know, garage band, as in you use whatever you got, reel to reel, you know, like these days it would be your singing into your phone, whatever, and being anti-establishment, okay? The fear that more organized countries had to that was, how do we clamp down on it? So then when Glasnost and Perestroika come along and they're like, oh, we're just gonna open up, they didn't really have much of, they didn't have clear communications with the people who had been clamped down on. They didn't have a clear understanding about, without, you know, opening up to saying, how can we support the youth movement? How can we, you know, instead they just said, here's a microphone, and then like, wait, no, and then people went in various directions about, don't say that, how do we stop you from saying that, how do you say that louder? And of course, we cannot underestimate that there was never a truly Cold War. There were always capitalist influences and other governments, especially the US, but you know, other imperialist governments who were pushing and manipulating everywhere. So Coca-Cola, Ronald Reagan, you know, the Eurythmics, those concerts, regardless of what the people thought they were doing, were also just blasting into people's backyards about, over here, life is better. And that's just turned out not to be the case, just as it's turned out today to not to be the case for any of us. So while it's useful, I think, to look at what our differences are and what our similarities are and how we got here, we have to be, give each other a little bit of room that what we know about any history comes from a huge filter of propagandists on all sides. And then the other thing is that we need to unify. We need to, and one of the things the CPUSA is really committed to is bring in the youth voice. Don't try to control it, try to listen to it, try to integrate with it, because this has been where things collapse or fall. Oh, last thing I wanted to say was about the word collapse, okay? We've all used it, you know, and it was pointed out to me by a 100-year-old comrade that collapse implies that there is some structural imbalance and that things just fell apart, that it's a Jenga game of some kind. And the Soviet experiment did not collapse, okay? It was murdered, it was overthrown, it was, you know, it was undone. But I disagree entirely that it collapsed from some kind of internal pressure. And I think that's my time.
Thank you so much. And I
You're
know
welcome.
you and Adam both did not have a ton of time to prepare, so I very much appreciate you guys coming together.
Thank you for having us.
So what we'll do, we're gonna have just some quick responses, some things that you thought, really focusing on things that you thought were quite similar or things that you thought were disagreements, and that gives you a chance, and we're going to get going, I imagine.
I'm sorry.
You need to get going?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
If you jot down on a piece of paper a question, I think then what we'll do is we'll go around, or points or issues that you want to raise up, then we'll go around and we'll, and I promise we're going to, at 8:55, we're going to shut things down. We're going to be out of here by 9, and we won't drag things on, and we're going for pizza at American Dream afterwards, if anybody has the stamina. Okay, Sarah, would you like to start?
Yeah, I guess I'm still absorbing everything. I thought what was so interesting is I'm here as like a political scientist. So I had no idea so much controversy was going to be generated by the Vanguard.
Great.
But I think one thing that I think is really interesting is listening to your comments about pop culture, because I remember when I lived in East Berlin in 1988, the most enduring thing I remember is the soap opera Santa Barbara came on East German television.
And also you could watch Dallas. And so East Germans, I thought, had this incredibly unrealistic view of what life was like in the West. And so I do think, I do think that was, in some ways, a huge tragedy for people living through the transition, is kind of the realization that TV is not the same. I guess the only other thing I would say is I actually would say the Soviet Union did collapse, but in the sense that kind of the rug got pulled out from underneath Gorbachev's feet, I would say, a little bit. So I wouldn't, in the sense that Boris Yeltsin goes off and signs a treaty with Ukraine and Belarus. And so, and I think what's so significant about that is, whether you call it a collapse or whatever, is that, I feel particularly for the former Soviet Union is there wasn't necessarily any consensus about what should happen. And there never was throughout the 1990s. And I think in part that might explain why I think the Russian experience is so different in terms of 30 years in. Sorry, I don't even know if I said anything.
No, that was great, actually.
It's really interesting. I really enjoyed listening to everybody.
Got actually a bunch of stuff. Specifically, first to go GLs, because you were talking last. I think that the problem that I have with the Soviet Union is not so much because I don't want to downplay the benefits of the people that were living in the Soviet Union. When I was tabling at Bernie stock, I think it was what it was, when I was talking to someone who was from Poland, and she talked about how her father was a teacher and her mother did not work for a wage. She worked in the home and stuff. And they were able to have a pretty decent house in Warsaw and were able to have weeks of vacation every year and just be very comfortable. And that's not something that you see in the modern America. And that sort of the guaranteed standard of living is important to remember. Also, kind of talking to Bill's point about, I can't remember exactly what it was that you were saying, but that the kind of the low standard of living in some ways of the Eastern Bloc was that those areas were just dirt poor before there was the creation of the Soviet Union or World War II, and after the Eastern Bloc was created, and they were starting from a very much lower starting point than a lot of the places in the West. And I think that is also an important thing to remember, because I feel like I talked a lot of negative about the Soviet Union, and I do want to make sure that it is a little more balanced and represents exactly what I feel about the whole thing. But again, the problem that I have with the Soviet Union is that it wasn't socialist enough. It wasn't. It's the same critique that I have of ancient Athens. These ideas that they had about democracy and stuff were good, but they didn't apply them. They didn't apply them to the slaves that were in Athens, and it's not the same, not exactly the same, obviously, in the Soviet Union. But I think that the ideas were not followed through on, and that the way to solve it is with just more socialism. You didn't socialism hard enough, I think, was my main thing.
I'm with you there. And when in doubt, socialism harder.
Exactly. I figured I wouldn't get a whole lot of disagreement about that. Also, Professor Henderson, you did say that the Western aid during the Cold War was a lot more about democracy, and I would.
No, after. So.
Did I mishear you?
Yeah. No,
okay.
It was actually after.
Okay.
It's the collapse of communism that kind of, I think changes the nature of aid. So.
I remember you brought up the IMF as having a new role, being repurposed.
Well, the World Bank more, I would say, than the IMF. Sorry, IMF is, interest rates and monetary supply, and World Bank is policy.
Thank you so much. I'm not okay, sorry about that. I think that was a bit.
Oh, so I don't mean to cut you off, but I did not think that democratization was a cornerstone of Cold War era aid. That's all.
Okay. Just wanted to. Yeah, because that would, if you would have said it, that would have been incorrect.
No.
But yeah, and I think that I would say that I would also still push back on the idea like that the World Bank has really changed in what it does. I think that it is still a lot of trying to perpetuate the modern era of colonialism that we're living under, where that using economic pressures to enforce a lot of Western demands on other countries, which is not new. I think it's just continuing, and I think that it is important to remember the ways that economic pressures are used on, especially the global South.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has conditionality, yeah.
Mhm.
But we don't have to talk about this.
That's-
Our audience may bring us right back to it, so keep it brewing. Bill.
Yeah, so a couple of things I was thinking about as everyone was talking. First is, I'll practice a little self-criticism, I guess, and that is that nationalism was really so much more important than socialists in the 19th and early 20th centuries had ever thought would be the case. And so when we think about what happened in the East Bloc, I think we have to be really aware, right, of the situation in Russia, right, and then the situation everywhere else, right, where the system was often viewed as imposed by Russian power, right, and so that had, in addition to many of the other things we talked about, no offense, but one of the results of the Vanguard Party, in addition to all those things, this imposition of Russian authority, right, over the East Bloc. I still remember when the Russians kept the Soviet marshal in the cabinet of the Polish government throughout the 1950s, just to keep an eye on the Poles. Those kinds of things drove the so-called allies in the East Bloc nuts. So nationalism was super important, and we saw that, of course, once the regime began to relent in terms of the coercion, then nationalist sentiment exploded, right, in the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev was unable to rein it in. He would have had to shoot to do it, and he was too humanitarian to do that, right, to his credit. But they didn't. Right? So anyway, nationalism was one issue that I thought I needed to certainly talk more about. I thought culture was super important. I thought that was a really important point that you brought up and that others brought up about the power, right, of the importance of soft power, right, during the Cold War. It is true, right, that it was better to live in a second world country than to live in most third world countries, right? And I remember I was involved in international conferences in the 1980s, and there would be people there from all around the world. And a really good example was I was sitting next to this Bolivian guy at a conference, right? And he had been living in East Germany and then in West Germany, right? There was competition to get these people to come and live in the various countries. And I said to him, so what did you think? What was your view? Where did you like living best? And he said, well, West Germany is great. He said, the standard of living here is terrific, but we'll take East Germany. Right? Because they, everybody's got a roof, everybody's got free meals, everybody goes to school, and everybody has clean water. So he said, in Bolivia, we have none of those things. So we'll take East Germany first, and we'll get to West Germany later. That was a very sensible set of comments. And it reminds me, right, of who these people were who were in the communist parties in many of the East Bloc countries. Erich Honecker, for example, was a roofer, right? A lot of these guys were bench workers, right, who had been members of the Communist Party all of their lives. And for them, socialism was 3 squares a day, a roof, and clean water, and education. That's it. All the other stuff was fluff in their view. Right? Problem was, it wasn't fluff. Right? People they need more than just 3 squares a day. Right? And after a while, the 3 squares that a lot of people were getting in those places weren't that good. Right? And you start to think about, might be nice to have something else. Right? And that's where the soft power of the West was very powerful. Right? Last point, and this is connected to some of the things that were being discussed just a moment ago about the capitalist infrastructure of the world, WTO, IMF, and so on, and the power of the global capitalist economy. The Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc were always at war with the West, right, on the one hand. And then they were also in bed together, right? Because there was a certain point when the East Bloc elites realized that the jig was up. They couldn't generate the surpluses that they needed to deliver the goods. They couldn't deliver the hot dogs, right, that they had promised the people. And so they decided that to deliver the goods, to make good on that promise that socialism was supposed to deliver, they would borrow from the West. And they borrowed, and they borrowed, and they borrowed in the 1970s when the world was awash in capital, right, from the Arab states. And that's why when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, and you walked down the supermarket aisle in Binghamton, New York, there would be row upon row of Polish hams, right, that a graduate student could buy with great Hungarian or Romanian wine, right? It was a feast for us. Whereas in Poland, there was no ham, and in Hungary and Romania, there was no wine, right? Because they had to sell every goddamn ham and every goddamn bottle of wine to the West to pay the debts, right, that they owed to the Western banks. So they were completely interlocked with the Western world economy by the 1970s. Once that happened, that's a tacit admission, right, that the game was over. And then it was just a matter of time. We see this now in retrospect. We didn't really realize it in the 1970s. I mean, in the 1970s, people were talking about people like, who's the great nuclear physicist from Sakharov. Sakharov and people like him were writing about convergence. They were talking about how the two systems were moving together, right? Because détente had set in, right? And people were starting to cooperate more, and both were industrial societies, urban societies, lots in common, right? Convergence. Of course, that ended with détente. So those are some of the things I was thinking about as we were contemplating collapse.
Observations or comments?
Yeah, I'll go back to some of those things I made notes about while you two were talking. So I noticed a lot, little nuances of language, like referring to the peasants, and there's a kind of condescension in your analogy that and when we talk about the collectivization of farming, particularly, some of the analogies to what would say is analogous now to the farmers, we're not what we would now call peasants. We might look at more like a commercial farm, and the reaction to trying to collectivize quite largely, and having people say, I'm going to murder my livestock and salt the ground, rather than, and I am not, a one-man farmer, or a family farm. I am kind of, modeled more on a serfdom where other people are working for me. And the collectivization of farming meant bringing into all of those farms tractors and things that they'd never had before. But the people who were going to lose money were like, no, I'd rather none of you have it. I'm just going to take what I can carry. And the revolutionary aspects, and the who is your enemy and who is your ally, and which are our people and which are, agent provocateurs, I think, yes, has historically throughout every reshaping of society led to some bloodbaths in which, regardless of what you think about the use of violence as a revolutionary tool, definitely some people who should not have been caught up on that, we can all agree on, will end up getting caught up in that machine. But I think it's important that we be aware how we're using words like peasant, and it's that cogs in the machine, that we act as if the active party only is the state and is not made up of any of those people, and that we're kind of exploding that in a way that I don't necessarily think is accurate or useful. Black markets are one of the other things that I think became part of the black markets, pop culture, all of those things, where rather than dealing with the bureaucracies that were set up to say, this is why we think this is unhealthy, this is why we think this isn't good for the society to have, they're just like, well, we'll just have them over here. And we will see all these luxuries as associated with anti-authoritarianism. So we're like, hey, well, here's a door to unlimited anti-authoritarianism, unlimited luxury. Like, don't you want to go through? Yeah, but they don't realize that when they walk through, they're going to be locked out of those apartments. There's no coming back to it. There is nothing to come back to. And I think that the choices that were put to people, kind of like the people who, after Brexit, said, oh, I didn't realize what I was voting for. You know, I was just trying to make a statement. I didn't realize that I would be stuck with the choices that I've made. That they didn't realize that they were actually being given a choice between, gangster capitalism, you know, which is what Russia pretty much has now, and
What they already had?
a what?
What they already had.
I don't think that what we have now, any one of us in this room, can be compared to what they already had, because I know that every one of us has to struggle with where is the next meal, where is the next, that we're all individually responsible. And we're taught as a culture that that's normal, that we should be individually responsible for whether or not we're dry, safe, fed, you know. So I don't know that what they found through that door is what they already had. But I think that they found that Santa Barbara and Dallas didn't look like what they'd seen on, or Dynasty or whatever, didn't look like what they'd seen on the television, and that there was no place for them there. And that what has come up now is, what we're seeing is the resurgence of Nazism, the resurgence of, you know, the nationalist hoarding kind of idea, and the blaming the immigrants, whether those are, you know, in Germany, where they're blaming, that they're saying they're still under the great, you know, drama of having East Germans show up and now want to take apart in their taxes. And or the other thing that doesn't get really talked about anywhere here is the idea of zero unemployment. We manipulate in the US those numbers a lot to invent ideas of zero employment, where people have, you know, like several jobs and are still having to sleep in their car between them and can't pay their rent. But the idea that the government actually made sure that you could be employed, and, you know, it's just, anyway, so I've kind of wandered far afield there. I don't know if I addressed all of those things. Oh, Pussy Riot. Bringing back to the oppression, you know, we've got Putinism. Pussy Riot it's his downfall thing. They don't know how to deal with this thing that they're like, this is very popular cultural thing. Music is one of those things where it's like, how do we deal with this? And they can't integrate it, they can't use it, it just wiggles free of them, and so they just crack down. And how we respond to that can cause fissures in those systems that I don't think necessarily were built to collapse.
Fantastic. Okay, we have 40 minutes. I promise to get you up here on time for questions, comments. Raise the back.
Got two real quick ones. I think Pussy Riot is more popular with Western intellectuals than it is with the Russian people. But that's a matter of
That
debate.
is correct. They get very little sympathy in Russia.
And this is for the two panelists in the middle. You talked about the Vanguard Party. Do you think that without the personal will of Lenin, that the revolution would survive at all? And would the left SRs have been able to build a state capable of defeating Nazi Germany?
I mean, I think
This is speculation.
I think it's important to remember that the Bolsheviks and Lenin did not want the revolution in 1917. They were not ready for it. The movement did not come from the Bolsheviks from up top. It came from the bottom up, from the Soviets and from the workers' councils and stuff.
Do you think it would have, so you're saying it would have survived without the personal will of, I personally believe that the personal will of Vladimir Lenin made the revolution succeed in 1917.
Well, I would look at it this way. In January of 1917, Lenin was in Switzerland.
Saying he never lived to see the revolution.
Correct. And 10 months later, he's running Russia. How did that happen, right? So I basically agree with Ronald Sunni, right, who sees the revolution as a series of revolutions. So 1917 consists of a series of revolutions, right, beginning spring, and then there are several waves of revolution. Different groups rise up. What Lenin recognized was that a political vacuum had opened up, and now was the moment to strike, right? And that's where you have the importance of individuals in history, right? He, against the will of the majority of the Central Committee of the party, right? He swung them around, right? And he whipped them into line, and he got them to act, right? And so that was a demonstration of his great skill as a leader, right? There would have been a revolution, I think, in the fall. I don't think it would have been necessarily a Bolshevik revolution, because the what do you call it? The provisional government was shot.
Well, plus, he lost the only election that they ever had.
Oh, that's why they just got rid of it.
Yeah, exactly.
They didn't win the election.
Yeah.
There you go.
I also think just a small thing is that I don't, based on what I understand of World War II history, about the history of the Eastern Front, I don't see any scenario under which the Nazis win. There is just the ideology of fascism would force them to make decisions that were just absolutely terrible, awful, dumb, stupid decisions. I mean, I'm not saying that it wouldn't have been. Yeah. It's. I mean, I think that if you would have, like, let's say, like, you have the alternate history of a left SR Soviet Union, essentially. I don't think that the data does not bear out that the Nazis could have beat France, Britain, the United States, Russia.
History is certain. I mean, the Nazis could have won the war and ruled the world. The fact that they didn't isn't proof that they weren't going.
Well, but I'm not talking about like that. Oh, because they didn't, it wouldn't have ever happened. I'm talking about like that they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the manpower, they didn't have the factories, they didn't have anything that would have let them actually do that.
Without
the
Vanguard
tanks sucked.
Party leadership after the destruction of the revolution, though, I mean, it was that Vanguard Party leadership that industrialized Russia after the destruction of the Civil War. I mean, that was what allowed Russia to win, to defeat the Nazis, was Stalin's industrialization.
I would disagree.
Speculation. I'm just curious.
Well,
Yeah, and
I
I would
don't know
disagree.
how we got onto the fascist thing. I mean, it gets.
Well, I guess my original part of the original question was just would the left SRs, which were they were a lot more popular than the Bolsheviks during the revolutionary time, but had they succeeded and implemented a socialist system without this vanguard system, without it wouldn't have been as totalitarian. Would they have been able to have, in that short time period, been able to rapidly build up the state quickly enough to defeat?
No, that's the great question that Isaac Deutscher raised, 50 years, or 75 years ago, whatever that was. The thing about the SRs, I don't know if the left SRs were a larger group than the right SRs. But
SRs in general.
Right, but the thing is, in 1925, the Soviet Union was a peasant utopia. There were 25 million farmsteads. There had never been so many, because the slogan of the revolution was land to the tiller. That's how Lenin won the revolution, by basically telling the peasants, land to the tiller. That was one of the key elements of the slogan. Right? So in 1925, you have 25 million farmsteads, most of them quite small. Okay? Most of them, even the kulaks, the so-called rich peasants, rather modest. Maybe they have a couple of cows, and maybe they employ some wage labor on surplus land. And the question really was, right, how do we build a socialist society, right, a worker state, in a society in which 80% of the people live on the land and on 25 million farmsteads. Right? And in a majoritarian, in a democratic order, okay, the decision would not have been made, right, to go down the road of forced draft industrialization in the manner that Stalin pursued. No way. I don't know what matter would have been pursued because there was no democracy. Right? And in the end, the decision was made in a room with 10 people, right, to smash the peasants, to crush them, right, and to subjugate the countryside to the urban population. That transformed Russia.
Any other questions? Comments? Well, I guess I have one. The one thing I was really kind of intrigued by the turn to culture and sort of the characterization of, you know, the world after 1989 is sort of dominated by culture. And when we were corresponding last night, I actually stayed up till about midnight watching Robert Downey Jr.'s account of the 1992 election. So it's called The Last Party. And so I had this question about the party. So he's going around and there's this kind of, at the end of the election, Clinton's elected and his father says, this is like the 60s all over again, jubilant at the election of Clinton. But the one thought that I had about this was, in the documentary, it sort of there's this account of sort of this deep cynicism in American society at the same time. And the thought was that there's a kind of way, it captures how there's been a change in politics. So from the 30s to the 60s to the 90s to the present. Like, I think this came across in your graphs. There's a kind of way in which something's happening now that needs to be accounted for. There's some kind of a political change. Because it seems like at this moment, after Fall of the Wall, these traditional political parties appear to be changing. I guess I think everybody sort of agreed with this. There's a way in which, like, you would characterize, Bill, you would characterize the traditional social democratic parties gave way to new parties.
Mm-hmm.
That they collapsed, and the social democracy itself doesn't seem to be. And so I wanted to know, this is a phenomenon that happens not in the East, but the West. And so we've been talking a lot about the kind of collapse of politics in the East, but there also seems to be a collapse of politics in the West after the 90s, and which is kind of characterized by culture. Like the 90s, watching the documentary was about the culture wars. Like there was like a kind of deep cynicism about politics and political parties. But there was like a kind of resurgence of,
But
Please.
this has always interested me.
Yeah.
Because for whatever else you think about the Soviet Union, like I teach American history, and it's very interesting that in a way the presence of the Soviet Union forced the United States to try to become a better country, right? And,
Sure.
You know, and as we went around the world touting ourselves as the most democratic, in a way we had to become more democratic because we were visible on the world stage. And I think about like one of the tragedies really of the collapse of the Soviet Union is you have the rise of Clintonism, Blair, Schroeder, this kind of all-out sort of liberal capitalism that is really about the individual. It's like a very different kind of politics, and it's no longer forced to. There is no longer that model out there that it's forced to best in some way.
Oh, your point of the collapse of the isms.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and I think it leaves a real vacuum.
It does, right? And for whatever its problems are, there is no longer that other kind of model,
Right.
right?
Well, so I guess the question that I sort of have is, so thinking as a socialist on this panel, the communists. So there seems to be a lesson from the 20th century that building the Socialist Party in the 19th century is going to end up very wrong. So these parties that Lenin is a member of, the social democratic parties of the 19th century, end up becoming quite the opposite. So there's a kind of a pathway. So looking at Adam with the kind of prospect of building a socialist party anew, and this kind of legacy of the political party having becoming like merging with the state. What would be done differently? Like, how would a political party socialist party, we're talking about a new international socialist party taking form, how would that, or has the party become anachronistic? Because there seems to be a sense from the 90s, like the 90s were characterized not by the building of parties, but sort of like a return of anarchism. So the anti-WTO protest, there was not, it's the kind of the post-politics. And so is in some sense when I heard you talking at him, it was like, maybe that's more desirable. Maybe one should not build the party. One should sort of like, what I heard was the bottom up. And it seemed like the 90s were characterized by the bottom up.
I mean, I think if you look at the new modern types of socialism that we've seen, the new experiments of socialism, you see the Zapatistas and you see Rojava, and I think those are the big ones that a lot of people think of. There's also Venezuela and Bolivia, and I don't want to forget them, but the Zapatistas and Rojava, I think, are very important to remember because it's not a political party, and there are political parties involved, and I think that it is important to show that that model of essentially like a libertarian municipalism or democratic confederalism or whatever any of the 1,000 different names that ideology you want to give it, I think represents something that's new and fits the modern world a lot better than a lot of the party organization and trying to seize the apparatus of the state. You know, the state, I think, is too powerful and it will corrupt.
Well, this seems to be the lesson of the 20th century. If you build the socialist party, you will corrupt yourself. I mean,
Just go ahead.
With the panelists, this seems to be the lesson of the 20th century, that if you risk building the party, it'll be Adam's prognosis.
There's another hand? Was there a hand?
I wanted to ask you if anyone knows whether during, the Cold War, whether in East Germany, you would expect that the mail would be looked at. Because I was corresponding with somebody, I didn't dare bring up the question.
Mm-hmm.
In that time. And then I didn't hear about it.
You would expect that.
Huh?
You would expect that your mail would be looked at, no question.
That's what I was expecting, of course, from what I taught in this computer time, I'm going up there.
No, but this is the standard procedure, right, for historians, or if you worked in East Germany for any length of time, you were on their radar, you were tracked, generally, and your correspondence would be watched.
So much easier now that we don't have Gmail accounts.
Yeah. I'll pretend like it's not happening to us too.
But I am kind of sort of wondering what your thoughts are on that. Is there a kind of, because Adam has one sort of approach on this, that there is a kind of, like there is this threat which is borne out in history. Do you agree that that threat is like inevitable, or is that something that one can deal with differently?
So this is interesting because, I was having some conversation on the drive up about something similar. And I think that what we need to look at is the way we work as social animals. And that the party, the point I'm looking for is, yes, things get corrupted, but we keep trying to make structures saying this structure corrupts. I think we can look back at the Stanford experiment and say, okay, these kind of roles corrupt. This kind of scenario is inherently damaging to all of us, but we don't really entirely understand why we do those things that we do, why people work against their interests, why we can't build effective coalitions. And I don't think the party structure, and this is where, where we split sometimes, anarchists and communists, where our goals are identical, but our idea about where the corruption comes in. And one of the problems with discarding the idea of the party is that, and you call yourself a libertarian anarchist, is that correct?
Libertarian socialist, yeah.
Libertarian socialist?
It's all kind of
Well,
squirrely.
is that both of those models, in my opinion, can only work in very small sets. That you're deliberately saying, we can draw a circle around this area and we can trust the people within it to act in good conscience, and we will not have any authority. Okay, but that doesn't protect anybody that falls outside of that subset. One of the problems with libertarianism, often is that it becomes really anti-communitarian. That it's like, this is my land, I get to do what I want, don't make laws, don't legislate to me about it. I'm like, well, what about all the people who are marginalized from things like that?
I would like to clarify that I have no connection with the right libertarians. That is a bunch of bullshit. They stole our word. Go.
Right, but, yeah. So, thank you. And I didn't mean to besmirch you that way, saying I think that you're part of the racist, anti-feminist, whatever. But I think that those models that can only work small are one of the reasons why, like in the CPUSA, we build things by cells. But we all have to be interconnected in some way. And we have to be able to challenge each other about where it's working and where it's not working. And we have to be flexible enough to change it when it doesn't work. But anytime you just say just this group, and I'm not going to worry about justice for anyone else, that's not socialism in my opinion.
I think, sorry, but just as a small immediate thing to that is that I think if you look at the example of democratic confederalism, that at least goes to solving that a little bit. If you look at the example of Rojava, where yes, each individual commune and each individual grouping does is internally focused a little bit, they are also all still bound together in this confederation that works to defend the entire confederation, to defeat ISIS, to defeat the Turks and stuff like that. So I think that that's.
So I hesitate to use the word inevitable. I think that all institutions are corruptible, right? Corruption is a matter of choice. So I also think that a modern society, a modern advanced industrial society like our society requires a state. I also think that state can be organized in different ways. It can be a large proportion of decision-making can be made at the local level. But ultimately you need a state, and I think control of that state needs to be determined democratically. I have no problem with large parts of the liberal democratic model. I believe in politics. I do not believe in a future world in which there is no politics. It's impossible, okay, because people will disagree on a lot of things, even under a socialist society. What I hope for is a movement that can construct a society that is based on different axioms than is now the case. A society in which private property and the market are not the decisive things in our lives, right? But about the kinds of decisions we collectively make to meet human needs. That's the kind of society I want to build. In the process of building that, and even once we've established that as the system, there will always be substantial disputes among what to do next. That means politics. So this idea, and I love a lot of Friedrich Engels' writing, right? But this idea toward the end of his life when he was talking about, politics, the state withering away, okay, and giving way to the mere administration of things. Well, anybody who's ever been in any institution of any size knows that administration is political, right? So we're always going to need some kinds of political institutions so people can express themselves, right? And there will be parties, and they will be parliamentary, they could be a Soviet-style thing. They can all be corrupted.
I guess just to come back to Sarah's point, there seems to be a way in which politics, like the Clintons and triangulation, was only about interest groups, like pinging one interest group off another. Is that what a political party does?
Doesn't have to do that.
Does a socialist political party only just aggregate interests, or does it do something different?
It depends on which interest you're talking about. So I wouldn't regard it as a socialist party of any value if it, for example, attempted to integrate capitalist interests into its operation, right? But I like to think of the Socialist Party of the future as a party that will amalgamate all oppressed people, right? Workers, but not just workers, right? All the various groups who have historically been oppressed. and represent their interests. And that really is what, if you read the party programs of the 19th century, that is what they claim to be doing, right? And it's amazing, actually, if you look at the debates in the social democratic movement prior to 1914, when they fight, okay, tooth and nail about whether or not they should ever enter a capitalist coalition, okay, in a government, right, with the capitalists. Good God, right? The Germans refused to do it for 30 years, right? Of course, then when they came to power, they had no idea how to run a country. They had no experience. Right? I mean, it's all kinds of pluses and minuses. We talk a long time about that. Right? So, but you have to make choices ultimately. And Clinton made a series of choices that destroyed a good portion of the Democratic Party constituency, and we see the results of that now.